I hear there's an assistant on the Castaway set whose only job was to make sure Tom Hanks had plenty of hot coffee when they were filming over in Russia. Obviously he wanted to stay warm, but it also sounds like in addition to typewriters and Rita Wilson, Tom has a thing for tasty coffee. Well, he and all of you should know about our sponsor then, and they are Sparkplug Coffee, Tom. Christmas morning and a cup of joe go hand in hand, but the product we're talking about is extra special. It's premium quality stuff, and it's the best you've ever brewed. Not only is it going to dazzle your taste buds, but it's convenient and affordable, especially compared to the elevated cost of buying it at a coffee shop every single day. And Sparkplug will deliver right to the door of Canadians and Americans. Plus, Canadians don't have to shell out any golden tickets for shipping. And if you join the Autopilot Coffee Club, it'll keep coming as regularly as you want it to, but feel free to pause or cancel any time. The website is sparkplug.coffee/HYES. Why'd I read it like that? Anytime. Ooh. Using our HYES promo code will give you a one-time 20% savings. So hero boys and hero girls, give Sparkplug a try and find your new favorite. All right, we're solidly in the holiday season now that it's the 9th of December, and this is our first bona fide Christmas movie of 2024. All aboard and action. Have you ever seen The Polar Express? Well, hi, good friends and fellow movie fans, and thank you so much for downloading or streaming episode number 630 of this podcast that yaps about classic movies. Have you ever seen ladles out all the spoilers we feel like ladling in these reviews, so be aware of that right off the top. Just ladling and ladling and ladling some more. I'm the sometimes jolly man with a pot belly who's been part of every single one of these 630 podcasting extravaganzas, Ryan Ellis. My wife Bev, however, has missed plenty of shows, especially in recent years for various reasons, and she's not here today either. She continues to take one Monday off every month, and this is the one in December. Although, update, she won't be doing that in January when we present our 10th annual Month of Bev. She programs our schedule every January, and considering that, she won't want to miss a week. All right then, the movie. Cartoon Train Go Vroom was released wide by Warner Brothers 20 years and 1 month ago on November 10th, 2004. Tom Hanks being the star of it, or not, well he was, it only ended up second at the box office that weekend. Week 2 of The Incredibles made more than twice as many greenbacks, although The Express did hang around in either third or fourth place until nearly the end of the year, which is fitting because this is a Christmas movie and it was released a month and a half before that day. And it did perform well in the IMAX theaters. Trouble is, there weren't that many of those 20 years ago. So no, you can't really call this a hit. Although, yeah, it's fair to say it's found a second life on home video. I think many people have made this a staple to watch with their kids every December. Now, before I lay out more facts and figures about the film, let's do a brief plot description of this tomfoolery. It's not really a tomfoolery kind of movie, but I had to get that in there. You knew that. Robert Zemeckis directed it. He and William Broyles Jr. shared credit for the screenplay, adapting Chris Van Allsburg's novel. Tom Hanks plays several roles, all in motion capture, and he provides the voice for something like 6 of the characters. He's Santa Claus, he's briefly a Scrooge puppet, he's the main character's dad, and he's also that main character himself, Hero Boy. The older version, at least. All those are voices, and he does the mocap for all of those guys. But that's not his voice in the main role, while Josh Hutcherson is listed as the voice of the main character on the IMDb, along with Daryl Sabara, the brother in the Spy Kids movies. I guess it's Daryl's voice we're hearing, not the Yutz who went on to play PETA in the Hunger Games movies. I thought it was Hutcherson. I was going to talk about that in this whole thing, and then yesterday, oh no, it seems like Daryl Sabara did the main voice. Anyway, that character has no name. He's just called Hero Boy on the IMDb, and Nameless here is invited to board a huge train bound for the North Pole on Christmas Eve. Other passengers include Hero Girl, a lonely kid named Billy, he got a name, an irritating little punk they call Know-It-All, and all the rest. The conductor and a hobo, 2 other characters voiced and mocapped by Hanks, often help the kids out during their very treacherous journey. And then in the third act, the train arrives in Christmas Town, where we meet many elves and even the not especially jolly fat man himself. And after all he's seen and done in one night, Hero Boy learns to believe in Christmas spirit again. Or, in a nutshell, disillusioned Michigander travels more than 6,200 miles in one night, and all he got was this stinking bell? 6,200 miles. We'll talk more about that later on. We're going to talk about this later on stuff, because we're going to get back to a lot of things later on. Okay, what are we talking about when it comes to Rotten Tomatoes? Well, The Polar Express is a splat. It's only at 56% fresh, although the average is fresh overall because that's 6.4 to 10. We haven't covered that many movies in the history of this podcast that are not a fresh tomato. And there's quite a good sample size because there are 210 write-ups on the site, 210 reviews of the Polar Express. Roger Ebert was one reviewer who did like it, though. He gave it a very big Chicago thumbs up. I think he gave it 4 stars. As for the popcorn meter, it does have this film in the fresh range, but just barely at 64%. And that bounces out, doesn't it? 56% fresh is 4 points off of being a fresh one, and then 64 is 4 points above being a fresh one. So I guess if you average them out, it is a fresh tomato, but barely. This was 25 years into his career, but weak numbers like those had almost never happened to Bob Z. He had to get used to it, though. We're going to get way into that towards the end of the review, more building up to future things. I'm going to do a whole big deep dive on Bob Zemeckis at the end. But what about the box office numbers for the year that the Polar Express came out? This ended up 10th. Other movies we reviewed from that year, 2004, Spider-Man 2 was 2nd, Fahrenheit 9/11 was 17th, and Kill Bill Volume 2 was 44th. And while a near $320 million worldwide gross sounds pretty good, this thing cost $165 million to make. And I believe that broke records for animated feature film budgets, even more than anything by Pixar or Disney. For a high-profile movie with this actor and this director at that point in time, not even doubling the production cost, even if it was that high, is just not very good. Because the cost of marketing this film probably put them into the red. Although I think the money men were probably placated by merchandise sales and video game sales they made based on this film. Plus the soundtrack was very successful. And yeah, people watch it on streaming or home video in pretty big numbers every year, so there's something with that too. So like I say, a big deep dive on Zemeckis' career later in the podcast when I talk about him as the director like I do at the end. This is similar to what I did about The Rock when I covered Moana last year. It got all stat heavy. The theme there, the thesis was, as so many wrestling people have said, he's the biggest movie star in the world, or they'll say the biggest star in the world. Was he? No, not really. He's close, but he's not really. In this case, has Robert Zemeckis' brilliant career just about completely cratered since the turn of the century, but we'll get to that later. Okay, back to the Polar Express specifically. It had 3 Oscar nominations for the sound mixing, the sound editing, which is a category that they phased out a year or 2 ago. I don't know why. They had that for my whole life anyway. Sound effects, I always called it before. And then just sound, but then it became sound editing, sound mixing, anyway. And for the Glenn Ballard and Alan Silvestri song, Believe, which plays in the end credits. And if you know me, you know that's a pet peeve. Many people were already unlocking their cars before the song was halfway over, so it's a mite bit of a crock that the song was up for an award. It didn't win the Oscar, a tune from the Motorcycle Diaries did, but it did go on to win a Grammy. As for the 2 sound nominations, Randy Tom was nominated in both categories for this film, and he has had 13 other nominations. His 2 wins, by the way, were for The Right Stuff and The Incredibles, which also came out in 2004. So he's competing against himself. Contrast to the Rand man, Alan Silvestri, Zemeckis' longtime composer, has only ever been up for 2 Oscars. The other was for the Forrest Gump score, and this is the man who composed that legendary music for Back to the Future, and, well, almost everything Zemeckis has ever directed, if not literally everything, then most of it. I think he even came up with that Avengers music in the MCU, that you know. But regardless, just 2 nominations ever for Big Al. If you're still humming the Avengers theme in your head, well, I am too. You know what this wasn't nominated for? Best Animated Feature, which was an Oscar that had been in place for, 3 years, I guess? The Incredibles won it that year. That's fitting, and it should have. And Shark Tale was one of the other 2 nominees, along with Shrek 2, which I liked quite a bit, and that's a worthy nomination. But since the Polar Express is at least better than Shark Tale, there's a nice irony that the Express was a candidate in the animation category of the top 100 genres for the American Film Institute, but Shark Tale wasn't, so revenge on you, Shark Tale. On that note, this film's animation is impressive, and the print on Prime looks fantastic, but of course there's that uncanny valley and dead-eye thing going on that people complained about in 2004, and I'm sure they still do now. You animate humans, you run that risk, even in 2024. I didn't really dwell on it then, or when I watched this about a week ago. Animation companies can't seem to portray convincing human faces, even now, 20 years later, so either you don't let that stick in your Christmas craw too much, or I suppose you just don't bother watching a movie like this at all. It also helps this is either just a dream or it's a fantasy. It's definitely not real. It couldn't be real, so they don't have to look photoreal. They were establishing a standard because this film was the first one to use all digital capture, as they called it, and that was for all the actors. It's one thing to do Gollum that way in the Lord of the Rings movies, but this is everybody we see on screen in mocap. It's not just one actor doing it with other actors who are going to just be themselves on screen. And I guess this was released in 3D, too, back before that was common. When Avatar came out 5 years later, that was so common. I don't think I saw this with the goofy glasses on myself in 2004, but I did see this on the big screen. So that's my buildup of critical opinions and box office and other accomplishments. The time has come today to ring some Christmas bells and see what's going on in the Polar Express. We're off to a good start because I like the touch of putting snow and ice on the various logos off the very top, as Alan Silvestri's gentle score plays us in. Although this is a score that actually sounds a lot like the Elf theme music, a Christmas movie also that came out just the previous year. It's not like he was aping something that was done back in the 40s. It was a year ago. And Silvestri uses that music a lot. So I just kept hearing Elf, rather than thinking of this as an original creation. John Debney should have sued somebody's buttocks. Directly in the buttocks. The grown version of Hero Boy narrates the story we're about to see. Spoiler alert. Spoiler alert. Spoiler alert. I guess the kid doesn't die during this movie if he can grow up and narrate about it. And he almost does die many times. But anyway, the voiceover says he was listening for the ringing bells of Santa's sleigh, and he does hear some bells. Wait, I thought the theory here was this kid doesn't believe in jolly old St. Nicholas anymore. So why is he deliberately listening for sleigh bells? Aren't you undercutting his skepticism right off the hop? Seems like he should be more cynical and think the sound of bells is anything but a present giver rustling about on his roof. That's not Santa Claus. But right away, he's a believer. Heh, gotcha. Anyway, ringing isn't all he hears. He overhears Dad's voice while he's putting the kid's sister to bed. Her name is Sarah, right? Sarah? Apparently, by the way, the kid in some versions of this or the video game or something is Chris, based on the writer Chris Van Allsburg. But he's Hero Boy in the credits, so I'll call him that through this review. Hanks does the voice of Pops and of Hero Boy's grown self, by the way, and doesn't do very much to differentiate them. Sounds about the same. We all love Hanks. But did he have to do all the voices or nearly all the voices here and sound about the same? Although I guess at first he was going to perform in the mocap suit for every single character, but that was just too much for him, and I assume it also would have been too time-consuming. And every scene, especially when he's Santa Claus and he's also the conductor and he's the Hero Boy, you'd have to shoot it probably, 3 or 4 times, different ways, while he acts like he's somebody else and plays off a stunt double. Then he's that person off a stunt double, then he's that one off a stunt double. That would take forever. Anyway, a pregnant mom and a not pregnant dad kiss our young fellow goodnight while he pretends to be asleep. Dad says something very key to the whole plot. This is the end of the magic of him believing in Santa Claus. You're one to talk, old man. We find out at the end that you don't believe in him either. Grown-ups, is there anything we do believe in? I believe I can fly. I believe I can touch the sky. After dozing off for a short while, Hero Boy wakes up to find his room shaking. That's because the titular conveyance is motoring down the street. I was thinking about this again recently, that line in Booksmart. It's the titular role. It's a great line reading. So as so often happens in movies, you could argue that this entire story from this point on is just an elaborate dream. He's in REM mode. It's funny how many movies do use that as a device, too. Somebody gets knocked out or passes out or falls asleep, and the rest of the story is, arguably, just in their imagination. But in this case, let's just go with the notion that all we're about to see really did happen to this kid, in a magical realism kind of way at least. I'll probably poke holes in that here and there, but basically I'll admit that he went to the North Pole on this train. Our youngster goes out to his snowy front yard to investigate the giant train on the street that really could cause a lot of havoc. I get annoyed when our neighbor parallel parks too close to our car, never mind having a locomotive in the way. Fortunately, nobody drives down the street on Christmas Eve just before midnight in this town. Everybody's home in their comfy beds. Now, Hanks' main voice role in this movie is as the conductor, and here he is scolding the kid for not having Christmas spirit the way he used to. Well, darling, we all age. Anyway, the train boss wants the boy to climb aboard, but he shies away, although he does hop on once the train starts to move. There's a nice detail here when the snowman that I assume he built in his front yard looks like it's waving at him, but it's just the wind moving the stick arm a little bit. It's got a glove on the hand as well. The Express has picked up a lot of other kids before this because there are something like a dozen of them on board. They even sing a song about the titular conveyance, the Polar Express. It's the titular role. We meet Eddie Deason and Nona Gay here, who will be key characters in the rest of the story. Deason is called Know-It-All in the credits, and that's what at one point the Hero Boy calls him. And Gay is Hero Girl. And what do you know? A golden ticket. You got a golden ticket. You got a golden ticket. Magically appears in the left pocket of our young man's robe, which the conductor takes and hole punches a B into. Know-It-All's ticket ends up having an LE punched in. More on all this later on. More later. There's one last kid to pick up, although the rubber-booted tyke. Rubber boots in winter? It's pretty cold out there, kid. Well, he, anyway, hesitates just like Hero Boy did, deciding he wants on only once it's moving. And he waited longer than Hero Boy did, so the train's moving faster when he tries to get on. I had dark visions of him managing to grab hold of the railing on the side of one of the cars and then lose his grip and end up getting creamed under the tracks. Didn't that happen to somebody? I mentioned this on Dr. Zhivago a long time ago. Some actor was supposed to climb on a train, and she missed, and then she was hurt, maybe even killed under the track of the train. Ugh. Horrible thought. But no, this odd film doesn't get that scary on us. What actually happens is that Hero Boy pulls the emergency brake so the straggler can get on. The conductor is mad about that, but at least our guy did a good deed because the lonely kid did manage to get on during this hubbub. He stays in the back, though, keeps to himself, and he doesn't join the others. Peter Scolari plays this kid. We'll find out later is named Billy, although Pete doesn't do the voice. Jimmy Bennett, who went on to play young Kirk in the 2009 Star Trek reboot, has that job. And the cops are coming for me. I won't get through this review. I'll be arrested. Since this is a pseudo-musical, we get a song and dance sequence right here. Waiters soft shoe in, singing about how they're giving all the youngins mugs of hot chocolate. Yes, you are. Hero Girl hid a cup of the hot stuff under her seat so that she can take it back to the lad in the back, since she didn't get any. The conductor is all for this nice gesture, taking her back to help her serve it up. But trouble brews when Hero Boy sees her unpunched ticket laying on her seat. He takes it upon himself to deliver it, but it flies out of his eager little hand as he's trying to go between cars. Its goldness ends up out in the woods. The animation they do on the ticket flying away and landing in the snow amongst some wolves is very much like the way they do the feather that's floating accidental like on a breeze at the beginning and ending of Forrest Gump. It was unnecessary drama, this ticket thing, but it was very well animated. In fact, her ticket becomes the star of the show for a few minutes. The feet of the wolves running past sends it flying up to an eagle, who tries to feed it to her baby, but the baby bird chews it up in a ball and horks it out of the nest. It somehow goes flying back onto the train, first passing by the hobo character we're about to meet. Hanks does his voice, too. He's stowed away under the train, somehow not freezing to death down there. We'll find out how and why he's able to do so many things like that later on. But in the end, the ticket sails right back onto their very car where all the kids are. Lucky the tracks got all windy and gave the ticket a chance to catch up. Since the girl doesn't have a golden pass when the conductor asks her for it, he escorts her, somewhere. Hero Boy is really invested in making sure this girl he doesn't even know is allowed to stay on the train. I guess it isn't likely that the conductor would throw her off into the woods or something while the coach is in motion, but this is the kind of movie where that might happen. Hero Boy ends up going up on top of the train, which is going about 1,000 miles an hour, and he sees the conductor and the girl up ahead, or seems to for a second, but what he definitely sees is the hobo, who's gone from underneath to on top of the Polar Express, playing Good King Wenceslas went out on the... You know that song. And what's that, a hurdy-gurdy? Hurdy-gurdy man. He tells our kid that he's the king of the train. In fact, he's the king of the North Pole. I hear they had a meeting with all the important people, and Tyrion Lannister told everyone the hobo had the best story, so that's why he should be king. As fast as they're going, the hobo's hat doesn't come flying off his head, nor does the kid struggle to keep his eyes open with both wind and snow hammering his corneas and retinas and rods and cones at this speed. Rods and cones. The kid even asks the hobo straight up if this is all just a dream, but he responds with, "You said it, not me," which is not a denial. After asking Hero Boy if he believes in ghosts, i.e. him, he didn't say that, but I'm saying i.e., he shambles off. The kid tries hard to wake himself up, pinching his hand and splashing snow in his face. No dice, young man. This dream has another hour and 10 minutes left in it. And so is this review, probably. The hobo comes back with a light and some skis. We get another action sequence here as they both put their feet on his skis an inch ahead on the speeding train, which is going downhill, I guess, so gravity might make this easier. But then they get separated. The hobo jumps up for some reason and seems to evaporate into snowy air, while the kid ends up down in the engine car, which is where he finds the girl. She's manning girling the big seat, while the two engineers are trying to fix the light on the front of the train. Naturally, them doing that is remarkably dangerous. The two kids notice a whole fleet of caribou standing on the tracks up ahead, so Hero Boy pulls the brake for the second time in this movie. You could say the first time he was just being nice to that lonely kid when he pulled the brake, but he really is doing it this time for a very good reason. The conductor shows up and gets all agitated again because they'll never make it to the North Pole on time at this rate, but they discover that using one of the engineer's long beards to make him squeal is what gets the caribou to clear the tracks. It's either fear of his loud screeching or, I guess, appreciation for it, since one of them makes the same noise back at him. Michael Jeter does the voices of both engineers, by the way, although I guess they had to get somebody else to do an impersonation of Jeter in the final mix because the Jeets had died before the production was finished. There's even a nice dedication to him at the end of the credits. And we'll talk about the other voice guy later on when we get to the So the Cast section. Once they get moving again, we get more insane peril as the conductor and the two kids are standing on the very front of the train. "I'm the king of the world," Titanic style. "Jack, I'm flying." And things get particularly hairy when the train goes out of control down a Temple of Doom-esque set of tracks. There's one shot in this sequence that I have to admit nearly took my breath away. I like roller coasters and they don't scare me, but I also love the initial thrill when you get right to the peak and it hesitates, and then it starts to drop. It sucks your breath out in the coolest way. That almost happened to me watching this scene. The Express starts barreling out of control over an iced-over lake, with the threesome clinging to the front and nearly all flying off again, only to be saved by the hobo, who after steadying them, evaporates into snow again. But they're right back in the thick of it because the lake ice cracking means they may end up getting very wet, very cold, and very dead. Since this movie is more action flick or even a horror film than it is a kid's movie, Hero Girl's ticket comes loose from Hero Boy's slipper, where he had stashed it. So they have to track that down again while the conductor is busy guiding the engineers, who can't see where they're going for some reason. They get out of that mess, which is when the conductor finally has a chance to punch LE into the girl's ticket. The conductor has a key line here where he says, "Sometimes seeing is believing." It's key because look at what they've already seen. This kid should have been a believer at least 15 minutes ago. What more do you need? As far as the action and excitement goes, there are a lot of harrowing scenes set outside the train as it speeds along, and they're quite well done. I can see why people, especially very young people, might have had their hearts in their throats a lot watching this. So kudos, but this is not even the best train movie Zemeckis ever made, because that would be Back to the Future Part 3. Now, you probably know I adore the first Back to the Future, one of my favorite movies. The climax in particular is incredibly tense filmmaking, but I might actually prefer the ending of Part 3, even more than the ending of Part 1. Maybe it's the part where Doc and Clara are in mortal danger hanging off the side of the train, something that happens to the kids in this movie a lot, but that's also why during a lot of this death-defying middle section, this feels like a retread of that. I also read that you can see a flux capacitor in the engine room, so that would imply that this train is time-traveling, which means Zemeckis is stealing from himself in that way too, because Doc built a time-traveling train at the end of Back to the Future Part 3. But if this thing is fluxing and capaciting, then that would explain why the time is stuck at 11:55 for so long, even when they get to the North Pole. Anyway, back to the story. The kids pass through a car that's filled with abandoned toys, which are broken, dirty, and very neglected. Our long-dead dog Fox would find this sight of neglected toys more distressing than anything that's happened in the entire movie. Kids nearly died, but who cares? There's so many toys, and nobody's playing with them. The hobo messes with the boy by operating the controls on a Scrooge puppet, intimidating the youngster back onto the car where the other kids have been all this time. Know-it-all annoys him and us again, which causes our hero to go back to the caboose to hang with Hero Girl and Billy. Eddie Deason got a lot of mileage with that voice over the years in many movies, but ooh, he's annoying. The Billster, little kid Billy, is singing another mostly forgettable original song by Sylvestrian Ballard. It's called When Christmas Comes to Town. The girl joins in and they duet, which is pretty sweet. Then they all appreciate the Northern Lights and their first glimpse of the North Pole. I mentioned in the nutshell that this trip from Grand Rapids, which is where Hero Boy and I guess Billy both live, is 6,200 miles round trip. So yeah, this totally bogus journey was about 3,100 miles away from their front door. This is obviously a fantasy or even a dream, but just imagine being on a train that could do that. I looked it up, and the fastest train in the world now can go about 375 miles an hour. So even that sucker going at that clip the whole time would take about 9 hours to go that far. Yet this trip seemed to take an hour? Although yes, we're going to find out that the clock at the pole still says it's 5 minutes to midnight. The kids are singing the Polar Express song, the titular song, as the train pulls into its destination. But then they all wonder where all the elves are. At first this seems to be a ghost town. Well, most of them are gathered in the town square, silly. And there's a lot of them. Now this is a perfect time to say with all sincerity that these animators are dedicated professionals, and I have to salute their work. I'm especially amazed at how long it must take to conceive and execute huge crowd scenes like this. You could probably watch this over and over, look at that part of the screen, that part of the screen, that part of the screen, and see different details and think that would have taken you maybe weeks to do something as thorough as a huge crowd scene of elves and humans and everything else. But the caboose gets out of control for some reason, and our three main kids are put back in danger. The hobo shows up again, offering our boy some coffee this time, since this is a Tom Hanks movie and apparently he's a coffee nut. He should try Sparkplug. Otherwise he's useless to do anything about them rocketing down a hill way up there in the North Pole. But the train stops without killing anyone, because obviously this was a fairly innocent Christmas spirit-related conspiracy to introduce them to yet another adventure. The girl takes charge this time, leading the other two into a part of town where they find some angry elves working on the naughty and nice list. He's an angry elf. There's even a big bank of monitors showing various kids sleeping, and the camera shot of those punks is right up close, which isn't weird at all. One little liar appears to be firmly ensconced on the naughty list now, so the elves debate if they should let Santa know about this development. And of course they should. The man needs an accurate list. It's almost go time. The elves take a rocket-type device to get to where Santa is, so the kids follow in their own rocket, although they end up in the wrapping room. But no elves are doing any wrapping. Maybe they're done by now. It is almost midnight on Christmas Eve. In any case, good for them. Just use bags and put some tissue on top. I hate wrapping. I was never good at it. The kids end up sailing down a slide that leads to a huge pile of presents. Billy finds a gift meant for him, but it says, "Do not open until Christmas." And the other two remind him that technically it isn't Christmas yet. Geez, tell that to every store and every mall in North America on November 1st, or maybe even October 12th or something. It's not Christmas yet. I know they're adrenalized from all the near-death experiences, but I was surprised that none of these kids were fighting sleep. Our long-dead dog Sam would be appalled. You gotta get your rest. Oh, 22 and a half hours a day of it. The kids in that huge pile of gifts get caught up in a gigantic bag and they're flown by a dirigible to the center of town, discovering the know-it-all was buried in with all the packages, boxes, and bags. I love the detail as they're flying along that there's a compass under the tree in the town square, and all the directions point south. They are at the North Pole, so that makes sense, but it's still clever. Good detail. Elves parachute out and drop down to the middle of town, but we needed some more terrifying danger, so the big bag of gifts knocks the huge star off the tree. Before it can crush any kids or elves down below, a bunch of elves bungee jump down and catch it, just before it obliterates a guy. This is where the conductor sees a huge clock on a Big Ben-esque clock tower that says it's 5 to midnight. The trivia told me that it was 11:55 when Hero Boy first got on the train, so I guess we're just in time has stopped territory then. Time has no meaning here in Magic Land. This is Christmas Town, this is Christmas Town, Christmas Town, Christmas Town. The kids slide down the side of the ginormous bag of presents to join everybody in the square, witnessing Santa's reindeer fly out to get ready to work the only night of the year they ever do work. Reindeer unions are killing this country, man! Kidding, I'm a believer in unions. Hey, I believe. Anyway, the elves get the 8 flying deer in place and adorn them with bells right before everybody starts singing, Santa Claus is coming to town. Also in Elf. That song's at the end of Elf. But the big guy shows up, and thankfully the song segues into the classic Frank Sinatra version instead. Hero Boy's worked up because his view is blocked and he can't see St. Nick, but then his attention is caught by a bell that falls off the sleigh. Everything slows down, including Sinatra's song, and he picks up the bell like it's the most important object of his entire life. And maybe it is. He couldn't hear the jingle jangle at first, but now he can, because now he believes. Wait, this is what convinced you? Not the magical train, or the disappearing and reappearing hobo, or the thousands of elves at the North Pole, or anything else you've witnessed throughout the night. I guess it was a steady accumulation of belief, and now, bing, bell. Santa shows up behind him, and our fella tells the big guy, I believe, 3 or 4 or 25 times as he hands Mr. Claus his bell back. The amped-up know-it-all kid is told to cool his jets, which shockingly he does, and Hero Girl is called the embodiment of Christmas spirit by the man in red and white. And that makes sense. She's been good-hearted and selfless throughout this thing, including making sure to save some hot chocolate for Billy. And Billy's told by Santa that there's no greater gift than friendship. Luckily enough, he's made some friends tonight. Friends! He wanted gift cards. Hero Boy whispers to Santa what he wants for Christmas, and we don't hear it, but Santa announces that the first gift of Christmas will go to our Hero Boy, and it's that bell. Because the true spirit of Christmas lies in your heart. It's the message we get in A Christmas Carol and in so many other Christmas films, so why not just recycle it here too? The kid puts the bell in his robe pocket as Santa lashes the reindeer into gear. There's no Rudolph, by the way. The most famous reindeer of all. And he's not even part of the team? But did you ever notice? That's pretty common in movies that depict Santa's reindeer. They usually just show the classic 8, unless the story is about Rudolph. St. Nick takes off right at midnight and flies away with that remarkably big bag of gifts, lighting the Christmas tree with his lash on the way to town. The elves throw their red Santa hats in the air once he's gone because now they can party. With Steven Tyler. The Aerosmith front man gets 15 or 20 seconds of voice time, singing Rockin' on Top of the World. As the kids board the train to go home, Know-It-All's ticket has been magically completed and now it says Learn. Billy says many things as he turns it over and over, like count on and rely on, obviously meaning do that with friends. Hero Girl's ticket now says Lead. And this probably should surprise no one, but Hero Boy's completed ticket now says Believe. They all get on board and want to look at the bell that Santa gave him, but Hero Boy put it in the right pocket of his robe, which is the wrong one to put it in because it has a hole in it, and he's bell-less. The kids vow they'll help him find it, but the train starts to move and it's too late to hunt around the North Pole now. The last image of the elves is them slow dancing with each other. This is going to be one freaky party, maybe. He could have it, maybe. Billy is the first one off the train, of course, since he was the last one on. He shakes hands with Hero Boy and gets a hug from Hero Girl, only to find that elusive gift he found back at the pole is waiting for him under his tree. I think he's going to be all right. Hero Boy's next off. Know-It-All gives him a see ya, but Hero Girl gives him a hug and then a handshake. That seems backwards. Shake first, then pull the guy in for a hug. She'll learn, and she'll lead. The conductor gives him a wink and tells him that what matters about trains isn't where they're going, but that you decided to get on. It's the fun we had along the way, the friends we made along the way. And with a bellow of Merry Christmas, the conductor, the girl, the hobo, and everyone else slowly motors away. His sister wakes up our boy on Christmas morning, and they find a plethora of presents under the tree. And the last one, which is wrapped up in the same paper as the big gift Billy got from St. Nick, is where the pesky bell ended up. You could have gone with a video game, Santa, but, the bell. Although obviously it does cut it for the kid. The ring has a great sound, by the way, great sound design on that, which the kids can hear, but the parents can't. See, they're old and cynical. They no longer go in for tales of an obese man who's hundreds of years old and travels by slave-powered sleigh to break into people's houses and leave stuff behind, nibbling on dairy and baked goods before flying headfirst back up the chimney. Why don't they believe that? Hanks, playing the older version of Hero Boy, at least the voice, is back at the end in voiceover mode, narrating that some kids heard the bell for a while, his friends and so on, then they, and even his sister Sarah, couldn't anymore. But he still can, because all who truly believe always will. And to put a very fine point on it, the Oscar-nominated and Grammy-winning song Believe plays as the end credits begin. Josh Groban wasn't nominated for singing this song, by the way. Only Ballard and Silvestri were for writing it. But the Grobes belted out pretty nicely. And we're done. Movie over. Go home. Movie over. Go home. Were you entertained? Were you wowed? Were you moved? Well, I can't speak for you, but I somewhat was. I didn't hate it. I'll come back to that in my closing thoughts. But first, the cast. Tom Hanks plays 6 roles in this picture and voices about the same amount. Except, of course, he isn't the voice of Hero Boy. Daryl Sabara from the Spy Kids movies has that task. Given how involved Mr. Hanks was in basically every single scene, I guess it's fitting that he was the one who got the ball rolling on getting this movie made. He bought the rights 5 years earlier. This wasn't Zemeckis' project. Zemeckis wasn't even going to direct it at first. Rob Reiner had the job. Then he bailed when it kept getting delayed. I'm guessing Hanks was busy beyond belief around that time frame. Probably always has been for the last 40 years, maybe? I don't watch behind-the-scenes footage the way I used to on the DVDs and Blu-rays and so on, but it's fun to see snippets of superstar actors wearing a tight bodysuit, a swimming cap type thing on their heads, and those balls on their faces and bodies when they do motion capture. We've also all heard actors complain about how hard it is to react to visual effects that aren't even there, but this style of acting is that times 10. This is more like acting on stage, especially if the play is Our Town and there really aren't even any basic sets. Or that Dogville movie by Von Trier where they have just painted lines on the ground. House, fire hydrant, tree. You really have to use your imagination in things like this. I think it would be a fun challenge. But as much as Hanks is good at this and Benedict Cumberbatch and the Hobbit movies, as the dragon thing, Smaug, as good as they are at rolling around in their jammies, the kings of it are still Toby Kebbell and, of course, Andy Serkis. As for Tom's other movie credits, well, he's come up a lot on this channel. This is, I believe, the 12th time we've reviewed one of his motion pictures. That's got to be the most of any actor ever, especially because he's almost always the lead in a movie. We've done Splash, Big, A League of Their Own, not the lead there, Philadelphia, Sleepless in Seattle, Forrest Gump, Apollo 13, Toy Story, Saving Private Ryan, Castaway, and we even did a Now Playing Project podcast of Captain Phillips in late 2013. And if you think about it, we've actually somewhat reviewed even more Hanks flicks than that because of our Oscars preview shows. He was nominated for Best Supporting Actor for A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood, and 3 of his other films in the past decade or so were up for Best Picture. So we talk about him in the Oscar shows because he's in those movies. And I love the guy, so that's not a complaint. Nona Gay is the physical embodiment of Hero Girl, so it's fitting that she's depicted as a black girl. And that's never commented on. They just have, at least one person who isn't white in this cast. Gay was in something that Chris and I discussed on Scoring at the Movies, our sports movie podcast, Ali. She also had roles in both The Matrix Reloaded and Revolutions, and the Best Picture winner, Crash, although we haven't reviewed any of those movies, those last 3. But this was an impressive period for her, the early 2000s. But her resume is pretty thin beyond that. Of course, she's focused on her singing career, not so much acting, which makes sense because she is Marvin Gaye's daughter. And even though Nona is credited as the voice of this character, Chantel Valdivieso is also credited, so I guess she's the kid, really. I don't think Nona Gay can sound like a kid like this, can she? So it must be the Chantel kid. Peter Scolari is Billy, the lonely boy, although Jimmy Bennett does the voice. Tom's friend from their days back in the early 80s making Bosom Buddies on TV, Bosom, was indeed more of a TV actor than a film one. He was in Newhart, and he also played Lena Dunham's dad in Girls. He worked with Hanks a few other times after their Bosom Buddy days, including having a role in Tom's directorial debut, That Thing You Do. He's the host of that Ed Sullivan-like entertainment show that the band gets on near the end of the movie, That Thing You Do. Bad news, though. Scolari died of leukemia just a few years ago. I probably heard that, but I forgot about that. It's a shame. He wasn't that old, obviously. The man with the distinctively annoying voice, Eddie Deason, played Eugene in Grease, and of course Grease 2. We covered the first movie several years ago. He's worked with Zemeckis a few other times over the years, including in I Want to Hold Your Hand in 1941. Now, of course, that's a movie Spielberg directed, but Bob wrote it. As far as I can tell, Eddie D didn't have some kid dubbing him the way most of the other grown-ups did. He wore the mocap dots in his face, and he also did the voice, I think. Michael Jeter was only 50 when he died before this film was even released. So yes, this is his last big screen credit. He worked with Tom Hanks a few other times in his career, including in The Money Pit, and he has that gruesome death in the electric chair in The Green Mile. And he was in one film we've covered before today, The Fisher King. The guy who ended up doing a lot of the smoky steamer voiceover work, that's the engineer character, the engineer characters. The guy who did that voice in the audio booth after Jeter died was Andre Sagliuzzo? In fact, I guess we really aren't hearing almost anything of Jeter in this. It's Sagliuzzo. He had to redo that much of it, so it's really him, not Jeter. I love that just maybe a little bit of Jeter, I guess, at one point. I love the fact that Andre S. played Henry Kissinger in the chess movie Pawn Sacrifice, but was also the voice of the mouse in the Tom and Jerry movie from a few years ago, so he's Jerry in Tom and Jerry. Range, baby! And on top of that, he played JFK in The Express, a movie that Chris and I covered on Scoring at the Movies. So he was in The Polar Express and The Express. Charles Fleischer is the voice of the elf general in this. His most noteworthy thing is another voiceover role, and that is the voice of Roger Rabbit. And the last actor I'll highlight is Leslie Zemeckis, Bob's wife of now 23 years. She wore the skin-tight suit to play Hero Boy's sister Sarah and their mother. And I say 23 years now because I mean literally 2024. They got married not long before this movie came out. She's worked mostly in Zemeckis' films since they did this project together. Although she isn't in everything he makes. It's only 4 in total, including Here, that flick that came and went last month. I didn't see it, but I will eventually. I do want to see it. Their director, Robert Zemeckis, is now 72, but he still keeps cranking them out every couple of years. We've tackled 4 of his directorial efforts before today. Back to the Future, Who Framed Roger Rabbit, Forrest Gump, and Castaway. And that means we've now covered 3 of the 5 flicks he's made with Hanks. FYI, we're never going to cover Pinocchio or Here, so we're caught up on the works of these 2 dudes. Well, maybe I'll love Here when I finally see it and want to talk about it in a podcast one day, but not Pinocchio. That was terrible. There's a big gap between this and Bob's previous project, just like there was between Back to the Future and Roger Rabbit. I'm assuming that's just because of all the complicated logistics and a long post-production phase to make an animated film that in both cases was groundbreaking. This was, Roger Rabbit was too. But yeah, Castaway and What Lies Beneath got released 5 months apart in 2000. Then it was a near 4 full years before Warner Brothers showed The Polar Express to the world. And these uncanny valley flicks tended to take up so much of Bob's time in the aughts that it would be another 3 years before Beowulf came out. And then 2 years later was A Christmas Carol, the third of the 3 Uncanny Valley movies he made, but pretty much the entire aughts, Uncanny Valley. Now you could argue that a lot of directors owned the last couple of decades of the 20th century. Jim Cameron could, although Bob's old friend Spielberg is undoubtedly the king of that time frame. But the Z-Man is on that list too. I'm not an avid fan of his first couple of films. I Want to Hold Your Hand and Used Cars. They're all right. And I don't dig on Death Becomes Her that much. But from Romancing the Stone until Castaway, I own something like 7 of his pictures on either DVD or Blu-ray. So I'm obviously a big fan of the guy. I love Contact. That's one of the more underrated movies of the 90s. That's a beautiful film. Outstanding performance by Jodie Foster, and a great movie in general. The look and the design and the sound, all of it. But what about that deep dive I promised? So as we know, up until The Polar Express came out in 2004, he'd been going from hit to hit, good movie to good movie. But once he got into motion capture and did that for almost an entire decade, the results were mixed. But yeah, for about 20 years before that, he could do no wrong, with critics or with audiences. The Rotten Tomatoes numbers for those 4 films of his that we've already covered, Back to the Future, Roger Rabbit, Forrest Gump, Castaway, range from pretty good to great. But ever since the turn of the century, this man has a lot of splats, sometimes bad splats. And it's not like the bobber can say, well, I don't care what critics think if people pony up their money to see my movies, because many of his 21st century projects have been financial failures too. Okay, at least the Rotten Tomatoes scores for Beowulf, Flight, and The Walk are pretty solid. 83% fresh for The Walk really surprised me. I may have to see that one again. But it's his very recent stuff like Welcome to Marwen, The Witches, or Roald Dahl's The Witches, Pinocchio, and Here that took a drubbing from those who write about movies for a living. The Witches, which I didn't like at all, fared the best of those 4 by getting to 50%, which is still a splat though. And this in particular is interesting to me anyway. Before the year 2000, Bob directed 10 films, and the only one that wasn't rated fresh was Death Becomes Her. But even that gets close, because it's at 57%. But since the turn of the century, he's directed 7 motion pictures that didn't make the grade on Rotten Tomatoes. So that's less than half of his 21st century films that are currently rated fresh, 5 out of 12. And I'm including Castaway and What Lies Beneath in that. I think one's a fresh, Castaway, and What Lies Beneath I believe is a splat, but I did include those 2. And Bob hasn't been the moneymaker that he was in the 80s and 90s either. Although 4 films in his personal top 10 box office-wise are from this century, What Lies Beneath, A Christmas Carol, The Polar Express, and Flight, Now those numbers are unadjusted, so his top 10 would probably look quite a bit different if I crunched those numbers. Some of his 80s and early 90s films would probably bump into the top 10 if they were adjusted. But I didn't do that because finding adjusted for inflation figures is harder than it seems like it should be. But yes, this man has known a lot of success over the years. He's often directed a film that finished in the domestic top 10. This film was 10th in 2004, while Lies Beneath was also 10th in 2000. Back to the Future Part 3 just missed out on finishing the top 10 by being the 11th biggest hit of 1990. He's also had 6 other flicks wind up in the top 8 or higher. Romancing the Stone was 8th in 1984. Back to the Future Part 2 was 6th in 89. Roger Rabbit in 88 and Castaway in 2000 were both the second biggest hits of the year. And he had the number 1 film of the year domestically with both Back to the Future in 1985 and Forrest Gump in 1994. Although guess where they both ranked worldwide? Second, not first. You maybe could guess that The Lion King would be number 1 in 1994 around the globe. But would you have been able to come up with Out of Africa as number 1 worldwide in 85? Because I sure wouldn't have. Although both Lion King and Out of Africa are set in Africa. But he's a tale of two Bobs. We'll leave The Witches and the god-awful Pinocchio out of this conversation because Box Office Mojo didn't list them in their given years. They both apparently did make money somewhere on this planet, but those totals just aren't listed on the Mojo, domestically anyway. Of his remaining 11 films, only Contact in 1997 managed to even crack the top 20. A Christmas Carol got up to 21st in 2009, and Death Becomes Her was 24th in 1992, and then Flight finished 33rd in 2012, and it's harder to make the top 10 or 20 in the more recent era, granted. But everything since Flight, in fact, which was 12 years ago, couldn't get any significant number of customers to pay to see it. And these films usually had a big star in the lead role. Brad Pitt was an Allied. What? Yeah, right. That only got to 76th. Joseph Gordon-Levitt was the star of The Walk, and Welcome to Marwen had Steve Carell, but both of those films only ended up 127th. Although I have to be honest that when I started doing this research, I thought I was going to say that one of my foundational directors had been on a cold streak for pretty much 20 years straight. Or if there was anything that really broke the streak, it'd be one movie. Like I know Christmas Carol did really well in 2009. Although I didn't look up the budget, so maybe in a lot of ways these movies didn't succeed because they cost so much. I bet that's true. I didn't look it up. I should have. Okay, so this is an update to the podcast. I'm recording this bit a few days after the initial recording because I decided to go back and look at the budgets and the final box office hauls of pretty much every film Zemeckis has ever directed after all. I Want to Hold Your Hand and Used Cars back in his early days didn't cost that much, and they didn't make all that much money either, but they weren't crushing failures. They didn't help him get more directing jobs. That's a story he's told on things like the Back to the Future featurette, I think, and maybe even Romancing the Stone. But those first couple of films didn't bankrupt anybody, so yeah, they weren't good. At least they weren't successful, but they weren't giant failures. But the one that put him on the map, Romancing the Stone, was huge. It made way more money than it cost to produce. Same goes for the 3 Back to the Future films, and Roger Rabbit, and Forrest Gump, and Castaway, and What Lies Beneath. Even Death Becomes Her made about 3 times what it cost to make. Contact, though, is an exception to his dominance back in the 80s and 90s. It cost a lot, and it didn't even double its budget. I love that movie, but facts are facts. And I didn't write down all the budgets for these movies, by the way. I'm just telling you, though, they made so much more, 5, 10 times maybe in some cases, maybe even more than that, than they cost to produce. Now, we know about the economics of the Polar Express. I've been spending all this podcast talking about it. But what about Beowulf and beyond? Well, The Wolf cost about $150 million and made about $200 million. That's just not an awesome return on investment. A Christmas Carol raked in the cash, yes, but it wasn't even all that close to doubling its budget, so that's not so great either. Now, Flight breaks up the so-so-ness. It was an unquestioned success in just about every way you can measure these things. But here we go with the glaring problems ever since he made Flight. The Walk cost between $35 and $40 million and only made about 60. Not quite cutting it, is it, when you talk about P&A and all that kind of thing? It needs to make a lot more than that to be thought of as successful. Allied grossed about what it cost to make, so that's not much of a success either. And now it's time for the bombs. Welcome to Marwen didn't have a huge budget. It only cost about $40 to $50 million, but it only made about 13. We'll exclude The Witches and Pinocchio, although it looks like the budget for Pinocchio is just insane. Talk about not worth it. But the movie that just came out last month, Here, cost around $50 million, and yet hasn't even grossed half that as I record this at the end of November. And that's reuniting Hanks and Robin Wright. Plus, it does look interesting. As I've said, I want to see it. Still, dud. And that's Zemeckis' box office and whatnot compared to the budgets. I didn't give you exact numbers very often there, maybe towards the end. But now you have an idea that even the big ones like Christmas Carol, Beowulf, looks like they made money, but they really didn't. And now back to the original recording of The Express, that is Polar. I guess it's just discouraging that people like him and Spielberg and Rob Reiner and Oliver Stone are making far more disappointments in the past couple of decades than they ever did in the 80s and 90s. And for Spielberg, the second half of the 70s, too. Those guys were just good movie after good movie after good movie. And now all 4 of them and other guys, too. Not really so much anymore. Just as far as whether or not I enjoyed his work in the last 20 years, well, I like The Walk and Flight well enough. Denzel's fantastic in that, and he got a nomination for it. And I think Jim Carrey is phenomenal in The Christmas Carol, very underrated playing Scrooge. But maybe the biggest disappointment of all of this is that Zemeckis is just not making, necessary movies anymore. People aren't as excited about them like they were in the 80s, 90s, and maybe into the 2000s. Of course, you could argue that he's like the baseball player who won MVP awards and championships when he was young, and now he's just in the game, sometimes hitting doubles and triples, but just not smashing grand slam home runs like he used to. But it's also fair to respond to that by saying he doesn't really owe us anything else. My DVDs and Blu-rays of his best stuff will always be in the basement, ready to be reloved at any time. Besides, talent doesn't die. Watch him come out with something spectacular in a couple of years and get an Oscar nomination or something. He's only ever had 2 nominations, for writing Back to the Future and for directing Forrest Gump, and he won for that. Filmmaking is a young man's game, as the fellow says, but I think he could dazzle us with something important again. And I hope he will. I'm rooting for him. Okay, the deep dive into Zemeckis' checkered career is over. Maybe he wouldn't call it checkered, but I think I just proved the last 24 or so years it has been. Bob Z and Bill Broyles, who was also the guy who wrote Castaway, wrote this screenplay, and they based it on Chris von Allsburg's 1985 book, 85, Back to the Future. Chrissy V, by the way, was born in Grand Rapids, so that's why his main character is from there. Zemeckis was one of many producers on this project, and he does tend to produce his own movies, and plenty for other people too. He was a producer for Matchstick Men and that Hanks movie Finch, which is on Apple Plus, or at least it was, both of which I liked a lot. Finch is underrated. I was a big fan of that. Tom Hanks was fairly new to producing at this point, but he was a producer here. Tom's partner in Playtone Records, Gary Getzman, also had a hand in this, along with the book writer, Van Allsburg. Whatever. Getzman apparently said earlier this year that there's talk about doing a sequel, because when isn't there talk about making a sequel to an existing IP, unless it was a flat-out failure that everybody hated. Sometimes that's a better reason to make another movie. If they do make another one, maybe we'll find out that the kid grew up to be the conductor. What else would it be, unless they use entirely different kid characters, and then he could still be the conductor, Hanks could, and Santa. But as far as the story goes, you can't do a sequel with this character, really, because Hero Boy can't lose his faith in Christmas, because he says at the end of the movie that he could always hear the bell, even when he was a grown-up. So logically, he's the ticket puncher for some new kid who's lost his way like he once did. And if it's a time travel thing, well, there you go. That's how he could be this. Anyway, who cares? It's time to start wrapping this long thing up. Appropriately for this director, who's had some huge highs and pretty crappy lows in his career, I'm mixed on this one. According to my files, I gave it 2.5 stars when I saw it in the theater 20 years ago. I'm still there. 2.5 stars, the wishy-washy number. It is an impressive production. It looks great, and Hanks gives it his all. Zemeckis knows how to do exciting action as well as anyone. The kids survive some harrowing adventures. If you're not into the kids being put in danger, then you wouldn't like it too much. I'm sure Gene Siskel wouldn't like this movie all that much. But back to the was it all a dream angle. What happens here doesn't even appear to have actually happened at all, even in the world of magical realism. Zemeckis shows the kid fall asleep. I think you could read this as a very vivid dream or a nightmare, where Hero Boy learned some valuable lessons, but he never actually got on a train outside his front door or met Santa. And by saying that, I guess I don't believe. I didn't hear no bell. And what about the opinion I've seen a few times over the years, including reading this on Twitter just last week, that this is actually a horror movie? Is it? Well, it's terrifying on a regular basis. Also, Chris von Allsburg wrote the book. This is the guy who wrote Jumanji, which Joe Johnston and later Jake Kasdan made into fun kids movies, sure, but they're also pretty scary, especially for kids. They're always under threat of brutal death, and the kids, and especially the first Jumanji, are repeatedly put in danger, just as they are in the Polar Express. So a horror label might not be bunk. I'm not sure you'd want to show Polar Express to a very young kid, although I think parents probably do. And Santa's more gruff than he is jolly, plus the helpful hobo in the train is a somewhat unsettling menace to him. Of course, he seems to be a figment of the kid's imagination anyway, whether the whole story is a figment of his imagination or not. And then there's the creepy uncanny valley thing. Now, if the songs were more memorable, and if I felt as moved as they were hoping for by pushing that just believe message so hard, I'd probably be in, yeah, this is a good one mode. But not quite. This is just not the most inviting film, and I don't think they ever intended it to be. It's a Merry Christmas, sort of, Merry Christmas or else type experience. I guess the last note in this wrap-up is to say what I said back in November about those musicals, All That Jazz and A Star Is Born. I wish it was more fun. This could have been, probably should have been more funny too. So that was how I saw The Polar Express. I'll give you our contact details and let you know what movies we'll be covering in the coming weeks on this channel. But first, I've got my traditional 3 trivia questions for you. Let's see what your big movie brains can do with these. So question number 1, and we'll stick with a holiday theme for this one. In the song White Christmas, what's the line that comes right after, I'm dreaming of a white Christmas, just like the ones I used to know. So what's the line after just like the ones I used to know? Hey, here's a bit of a theme for this time of year too, winter sports. So question number 2, Name the Jean-Claude Van Damme hostage crisis movie that takes place during the 7th game of the Stanley Cup Final. And number 3 is Hanks related. Tom has played the title character in a movie, or at least one of the title characters, 9 times. 9 times. How many of those can you name? And I mentioned some of them during this review, so you should be able to nail at least a few of them. Okay, I will reveal those coveted answers after I tell you that next week, Bev will be back with me at the table in the podcast room, and we'll be tackling another Christmas movie. Okay, well, Christmas is a backdrop for all the sinister goings-on, but it isn't really about the holiday per se. Anyway, Stanley Kubrick's last ever film, Eyes Wide Shut. But before we open our eyes that had previously been shut, you'll be getting a show in just 4 days. We haven't discussed Billy Crystal very often on this channel, especially in leading roles, and I'm a big fan of one of his best comedies, and that's City Slickers. So gabbing about that will be my Huckleberry on the 13th. I'm your Huckleberry. Ooh, a podcast on Friday the 13th. Scary. Talk back to us. Give us your thoughts about this film or any other. Our email address is haveyoueverseenpodcast@gmail.com. We also continue to linger on Elon's toxic website, Twix. I'm at MovieFiend51 and Bev is at Bev Ellis Ellis. She uses that @ on Threads too, and I just recently joined Blue Sky, Ryan-Ellis, all in one word. And Bev just joined today as I record this. What is she? I didn't write it down. I think she's at Bev Ellis Ellis. Follow our show by subscribing to us on your podcast app. We seem to be everywhere you look for podcasts. Rate us, write a review. Also look for us on YouTube. Every new episode goes up there within a few hours of it going live as a podcast. Sometimes I change that up and post it on YouTube first, though. Sneaky. The web browser address for the YouTube link is at HYES Comment, like, and subscribe. And our sponsor, Sparkplug Coffee, will give you listeners a one-time 20% discount if they apply our HYES promo code to the right box. Sparkplug.coffee/HYES. Great stocking stuffer or great just plain old Christmas gift. Okay, here are the answers to the trivia questions. Number 1. In the song White Christmas, what's the line that comes right after? I'm dreaming of a white Christmas, just like the ones I used to know. Where the treetops glisten and children listen to hear sleigh bells in the snow. Question number 2. Name the Jean-Claude Van Damme hostage crisis movie that takes place during the 7th game of the Stanley Cup Final. It's Sudden Death. And the third and final question today. Tom Hanks has played the title character in a movie, or at least one of the title characters, 9 times. How many of those can you name? We've got Turner and Hooch, Joe versus the Volcano, Forrest Gump, Charlie Wilson's War, Larry Crown, Captain Phillips, Sully, Finch, and A Man Called Otto. He's Otto, and he loves to get blackto. All right, that's the end of that. Thanks so much for checking this one out. Join me on Friday when I do a monologue about City Slickers, the next Monday when Bev is here again and we ogle at Eyes Wide Shut. Meantime, I'm going to hustle off to bed. Santa might show up to my house tonight, even though Christmas is still more than 2 weeks away. I need to be ready, though, and I will be. Believe me, believe me. Hey, maybe I do believe after all. And cut.